Their next ploy was, well, there are a lot of terms here. This is a new field. Can we at least send some questions for the authors to answer to help us do a good job in our translation? So we all agreed to that. So in comes a document about that thick, asking everything about, who's funding it, what results we're getting, blah, 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 blah. So we all knew it had to come from the KGB. So we just threw it in the trash, and they finally gave in and published it anyway. Years later, a defector from Russia came over and approached us and said, "You remember that big document you got? I was the one that wrote the document for the KGB." When we did the experiments, published them in the IEEE, we had several series. If you ever go back and read the paper now, it's 1976 proceedings. Whenever you see Visitor 1, Visitor 2, Visitor 3, that was our euphemism at the time for CIA agent. You'll see that even a series that they participated in turned out to be independently statistically significant. About this time, the higher-ups at CIA were getting worried, even though Fraudbuster came out and gave us a good bill. He said, "How do I know the CIA people aren't colluding with the researchers who are colluding with the subjects?" So one of the CIA oversight people went to a different part of the agency and said, "Pick out a target, don't tell me what it is, because if good results come out of this, I want it known that me, being a monitor in the program, was not involved in colluding with the researchers and subjects." So his friend at CIA gave him the coordinates of a vacation cabin he had, actually in West Virginia. And so we had two remote viewers, Ingo Swan and Pat Price. Ingo started to look at the place and says, "Well, I don't see much here. I see some woods, I see some cabins." What the guy didn't realize, who had picked the site, was that right over the crest was this super secret NSA facility. Ingo said, well, right over there something looks really interesting, looks very military. Maybe that's what they want me to see. So he gives all of that, which turned out to match quite well. We then targeted Pat Price on it. Price was a very adventurous kind of guy. And so when he got there, he describes it like he's traveling. He decided to wander around through the facility reading name tags, sticking his head into a safe, and a bunch of words popped up into his mind. And so we wrote them all down, passed them on. Pretty soon the entire intelligence apparatus of the country, law enforcement apparatus, ended up on our doorstep. "How'd you get this information?" "Oh, we're just doing some ESP experiment." "Don't tell me that. Who leaked you this information?" It turned out that, in fact, it was very accurate. The write-up of the experiment included this statement: "Pat Price, who had no military intelligence background, provided a list of project titles associated with current and past activities, including one of extreme sensitivity. Also, the code name of the site was provided." They did a 5-year investigation. Couldn't find any reason for the leak. But what really saved us, because suspicion was always going to be there, was that, as you can imagine, this got briefed right up the chain. It got up to John McMahon, who eventually became Deputy Director of CIA. At the time, he was a division director. And he said, "Well, don't waste it on our sites. Try a Soviet site and see what happens. If we get good data on the Soviet site, I don't care if it's leaked or what." So we targeted Pat Price on a Soviet site. All we gave him was coordinates of the site, and he laid out some buildings and roads and that kind of thing. And then he drew this crane. When he drew the crane, he said, "I'm lying on my back on the top of a 2-story building, and this humongous crane is rolling over. It's so big that a man would be half a wheel height." And that's what I'm getting. Now, I have to say, I was embarrassed. I knew the 2 CIA guys were sitting in the motel waiting to see the data. To me, this was science fiction, couldn't possibly be. So I went over. I said, I'm sorry to say, but he's come up with this science fiction crane that's bigger than, it's got to be bigger than any crane in the world. There's the site. There's a crane. There's a man. I guess that's the building. And they were really impressed. So they came over, they introduced themselves, and then had him spend a week wandering around through the facility describing everything that he could find. Just to give an example, here you can see them all for comparison. To give an example of the kind of data he got, he said there seemed to be the main feature here is to manufacture these giant spheres out of wedge-shaped sections, and then they put the sections together with low thermal epoxy. These are about 60 feet in diameter. Well, it turns out that was the main aspect of that place. They were manufacturing. He missed in the low thermal epoxy was actually a new form of low temperature welding. But he went on, he gave all kinds of data about the site. Again, problems always arise. When they took the data to one group of analysts to analyze it, they said, we're scientific, this is nonsense, we're not going to look at it. They took it to another group who happened to be fundamentalists. They said, this may all be true, but this is of the devil, and we're not going to look at it. They took it to a third group. Third group, fortunately, analyzed it and thought it was pretty good. But they wanted to get an outside opinion, so they sent it out to Los Alamos for review. The people at Los Alamos were sure that this site was a particle beam weapons facility. And they said, well, you know, the crane is pretty impressive, but he says this is for some space project, and we know it's not for that, so you can't really trust this data. When the Cold War was over, we got to go over there. Turned out it was for a space project. Well, this is all fine, but remember, they did not like us getting this kind of data. All of our reports had things like advanced threat technique assessment. So they were finally beginning to realize, you know, maybe there really is a problem because they just keep getting this data. Well, this is all fine for them, but what about us as scientists? We wanted to learn something about this. We didn't want to just turn it into an operational branch of the government. So we got permission, we talked them into the fact that, well, you know, there's a new Soviet hypothesis that this is brainwave kind of stuff. So we should do some experiments to see if brainwaves could be involved. Well, if it's electromagnetism associated with the brain, there are a number of features that we can check. I mean, it should fall off with distance. So we decided to do a bunch of long-distance experiments around the country, out of the country, and so on. I could show you hundreds of those, and you can't believe how many of these we did. But I only want to show you two to make a particular point. The usual skeptical position is, well, they're going to say the grass is green, the sky is blue, and it's going to turn out to be right, and you know, it doesn't mean anything. The truth of the matter is that the signals come in apparently strongly enough that even when the remote viewer himself is certain it can't possibly be, it can turn out he's right. Here's one example. I was sent to Costa Rica. Each day in San Jose, Costa Rica at 1:30, I had to pick out some site, and I had remote viewers back in California, remote viewing. One day I had a chance to play a trick. I jumped on a plane, I flew to an island, and I was standing there at the airport on this island. The poor remote viewer, meanwhile, is getting in an airport with a long runway and ocean at the end of the runway. And he says to himself, I can't be right. He's in San Jose, Costa Rica. It's miles from the ocean. There's no reason for him to be in an airport. So he tried to erase it and see if he couldn't get the real site. And as it turned out, that's the only thing that came in. So he kept putting it down. And in fact, that is where I was. And so that shows that even